Che began similarly to the Cuban Revolution by ambushing military patrols that had been sent to find and exterminate the rebel forces. After weeks of this, Che splits his group into two groups: the rear guard, led by a rebel leader named Joaquim, and the vanguard, which of course he leads. He also sent two men to deliver a message to Fidel. Unfortunately, these men are captured along their way to a city and are interrogated. The poor conditions make it very easy to bribe the two men with simple food, who quickly describe their leader as Che Guevara, who at the time had disappeared from the American view, most American governments thinking that he was probably dead at this point. With evidence that Che was trying to start a new guerrilla campaign in his country, Bolivia, President Barrientos began a propaganda campaign against the rebels, often claiming that any person who went out to the rebel forests would be raped and mugged by the rebels. After failures in Bolivia, including the deployment of a newly formed Green Beret from the Americans to train Bolivian Rangers with the express mission to find and capture Che, he decides that it's time to leave. He must first gather his remaining troops. It has been 4 months since Che has seen the rear guard, who stayed at base camp with the sick, and they begin to move toward the Rio Grande to meet up. The rear guard gets to the river first and is forced to ask a peasant where they should cross. Unfortunately, the peasant betrays their position to the military, and as the rear guard is crossing the river, an ambush occurs. All but 2 men of the rear guard are killed. After this, Che's campaign in Bolivia turns into a quest to survive. They begin running constantly, being chased and ambushed, having to travel in harsh jungle conditions to the point where the men begin to hallucinate and become very ill. In 1961, 11 months after entering the Bolivian mountains, Che and his men are nearing a small town to get supplies when they are ambushed again. 3 of their men are killed instantly, and Che and another man are forced to run to a ravine near a nearby farm. The farmer sees them and reports their position to the military. Hundreds of soldiers are immediately deployed to the area, and as they come down the mountain, they find themselves in a position where they have cornered Che and his men, leaving them only one choice: fight. In this battle, some of the men are killed. Che himself is wounded, and his rifle is shot from his hands, becoming literally unusable. Luckily, a rebel named Willet comes to Che's aid, giving him support as they retreat. Unfortunately, they are captured a short distance away by men of the same group that had just attacked them. When asked who he was, Che said, "Hey look, I'm Che. I'm worth more alive than dead." It takes an army, but Che is finally captured. The date is October 8th. Che, using the support of Willet, marches several hours to La Guevara, a little schoolhouse that the military was able to convert into a holding cell. He's interrogated by a Bolivian officer there, who says, "Back a few weeks ago, essentially when the cause is lost, why did you not disband your group and run?" To which Che replies, "Where would I go?" I think just a stellar look at exactly what drove this person. He had nothing but the revolution at this point. A day after his capture, CIA agents question Che in La Guevara, and he refuses to answer any questions. A few hours later, Willet is executed in the holding cell separated by the school walls from Che. The American government gets back to Bolivian command as to the price of Che's capture. They get $500 for it being Che, $600 if Che is dead, and $700 if Che is alive. And it is decided that the government will be receiving $1,100 for Che's body. For them, Che is too much of a liability, and the radio is already reporting that Che has been killed in a firefight. When told that it has been decided that Che would be executed, his only response was, "It's better this way. I should never have been captured alive." Less than an hour later, a volunteer to execute Che enters the room that Che is being held in, and Che allegedly says those famous last words, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." Che's body is transported by a helicopter to a local hospital. The military did not even put him in the helicopter. They tied him to a gurney that was airlifted away. Before taking off, a priest steps forward and to give Che his last rites, an irony for a man who is a well-known atheist. His body is put on display in a town called Villa Grande, and the famous picture is taken by a photographer in the town named Rene Cadillac. Che's hands are removed to be sent to Cuba as proof of his death, in the fear of Fidel claiming that it was a government plot. The next morning, he is buried in an unmarked grave with the soldiers to prevent any shrine to Che being built. The resting place was undisclosed for 28 years before the location was announced by a former general in an interview by a Che historian. His remains were gathered from the grave and put in a tomb in Santa Clara, Cuba. Che's legacy lives on as a hero and a symbol of the revolution, despite its bastardization by American capitalists. However, looking back on his life, Che would have considered himself a failure. His dream of a socialist revolutionary war raging over Latin America was never even close to realized. And he who had fought in 3 revolutionary wars, only one of which did not end in disaster. Even if, however, he considered himself a failure, for us to do so would be disingenuous to the cause. 1 out of 3 revolutions isn't bad, and his example, as well as philosophy, gives us a guide to follow, both for success and for which ideas to avoid for failure. I think that because of this, it is not all excessive to say that Che nearly single-handedly shaped the way modern revolution is viewed and approached today. That's it. Right. Any questions? Less controversial topic. Hopefully.
Isn't that what you want?
That is what I want.
Do you know any details about Batista and his whole regime prior to?
I don't. I pretty much just stick with just Che history, so sorry. Yeah.
So just to be clear, there was an active falling out between Castro and Che.
There was a point where I think they were still loyal to each other, but what I didn't mention is that Fidel promised Che that there would be generals and supplies to meet him in the Congo. Fidel promised Che that there would be generals and supplies to meet him in Bolivia. Neither of those things happened. So at some level, I think Che just felt basically betrayed by someone who he thought was an ally. Yeah, go ahead.
So in this case, do you think from your perspective that it's fair to say that Che's revolutionary struggles outside of Cuba are less necessarily communist Al-Qaeda, but more of a way of having a politically feasible way of marginalizing Che Guevara from Cuban and Soviet international politics?
I'm not really sure. Are you saying like Fidel using Che as a force outside of Cuba? Or
Well, I mean, the usual characterization is Che Guevara is this revolutionary figure who is used by Castro in Cuba to spread revolution to other countries. Right, that's the dominant narrative of Che.
Okay.
But it seems to me, from what you've said and what I know independently, that instead what was happening is not unlike Trotsky in the Soviet Union, is you have a leader or a figure who becomes politically uncomfortable and is then marginalized, instead of being excommunicated from Cuba, as it were, being sanctified in this heroic sense, so that they can then politically be marginalized.
Yeah, I would say that's exactly a fair justification to say that that's probably exactly what happened, and that might be a little almost conspiratorial on Fidel's part, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, and it's probably what ended up happening, regardless of intent. All right, great.